Hello, my name's Alex, and this will hopefully be the first episode of the Ship Pod, a podcast that I've decided to make to fill in a gap in podcasting relating to shipping, both past and present. I'm incredibly inexperienced when it comes to putting media together in any sense, so please bear with me. Hopefully the quality will increase as time goes on if I decide to make this a more regular thing. I don't have many plans when it comes to what this podcast will look like in the future. I have friends who are incredibly talented, and it would be great to have them create segments or even entire episodes. They probably can add so much more depth to topics than I ever can hope to, so that would be really fun to look forward to. However, for now, it's just me, and I've decided to go over the story of the Willem Ruys, a Dutch liner, which I will get into in a moment. Firstly, something a little bit about me. I'm not a ship historian. I'm not a maritime historian. I do have a degree which relates to history, but that's only given me the tools to verify historical facts and to research. It does not give me any right to claim what is and what is not right in terms of shipping or in terms of ocean liner history. I've just read a lot of books about the subject, and I know a lot of people within the industry, both today in the modern context and people who have written about the past and who are passionate about the past. And that being said, anything that I say in this podcast, although I believe it to be true whilst I'm saying it, I will not stand by it if I'm given proof that it's wrong. I'm always open to criticism, and I am bound to make mistakes, and I accept that. So please let me know if there's anything that's bothering you that I'm saying that's wrong, or if I've misrepresented anything. And with all of that out of the way, we can start talking about the Willem Ruys, a legendary Dutch ocean liner, colonial Dutch ocean liner that travelled between Europe and the Dutch East Indies, which is now modern-day Indonesia. She had quite a long career, quite a dramatic backstory about her construction, and a rather sad ending in her second life as an Italian cruise ship. I have decided to start with the Willem Ruys because I feel like I know the most about her than any other ship at the moment. And I live in the Netherlands, so she was the first Dutch ship that I really got to know very well, and the first ship I got to know very well outside of, say, the Lusitania or Olympic or the Queen Mary. And also for me, this is kind of local history. The Willem Ruys used to depart less than 2 kilometers from where I am right now, from where I live. And I've been able to meet people who actually worked on the Willem Ruys, and she's a key ship in Dutch maritime history, and it would be nice to share that in English with people. And we can't really start talking about the Willem Ruys until we understand who her owners were, Rotterdam Lloyd. They were founded in 1883 and basically decided to collectively bring merchants from Rotterdam together to dominate the route between Europe and the Dutch East Indies, which is today modern-day Indonesia. They began with cargo services. They did eventually begin to transport passengers, but in no great luxury and in no legendary ocean liners. They were cargo ships first, and then they were passenger ships on top of that. And it wasn't until the 1910s when the mailboat concept came around for the line. And what this basically meant was that the line was going to focus more on speed and on passengers, so getting mail quickly from one point to another point. And this also worked well for passengers, so that's why often you'll see in maritime history ships, great passenger ships, especially from the UK, would be RMS, Royal Mail Ship. In Rotterdam Lloyd's case, this was the same for a lot of their ocean liners. They weren't RMS, but they held a similar sort of title in terms of the Dutch registry, where they were Royal Dutch Mail ships. This first mailboat, this first true ocean liner for Rotterdam Lloyd was the SS Insulinde. She came around about the time of the Titanic, although she was considerably smaller than the Titanic. And she was notable not just because of her being the first Rotterdam Lloyd ocean liner, but also because she had the livery of Rotterdam Lloyd, which was very unique for any ship at the time, let alone ocean liners, where they had very light grey hulls with a white superstructure and black funnels. Normally, when you think about an ocean liner, especially from around this time, from the 1910s, that you think of a black hull and a white superstructure and maybe an orange or something funnel, depending on which line. And Rotterdam Lloyd did not follow this, mainly because the majority of their voyages were in tropical climates. Basically, as soon as they left the Netherlands, within a day or two, or 3 or 4, they would be, in the Mediterranean, and then all the way through the Suez Canal and past the equator in the Indian Sea, and then down into Indonesia. So it's incredibly warm, and it's very important for the ships, especially before the time of air conditioning, to be able to regulate the temperature better. And obviously, having a more reflective, less absorbent colour is a great way of doing that. And this made their ships stand out in port. Although the ships always headed towards Indonesia, they would stop off in Europe, in Southampton, in Marseille, in France, and sometimes in places in Italy. And this made the ships really stand out against all the other black-holed ships. And even in the advertisements that Rotterdam Lloyd used, you can always see they stand out at you in comparison to other ships or other ship advertisements of the era. In the 1920s, Rotterdam Lloyd, they had quite a number of ocean liners, and decided that in the 1930s they would need 2 sister ships. And these came in the form of the MS Beloren and MS Dempo. They were quite small in comparison to the transatlantic liners. They were quite low profiled. They had an awful lot of deck space and an awful lot of awning space. So people could be on the deck but still be in the shade. Again, attributed to the route being such a tropical one. And they were very popular, and they helped Rotterdam Lloyd gain such a valued reputation amongst ocean liner passengers. However, after the Great Depression, ocean liner characteristics were changing, and Rotterdam Lloyd, along with lots of other European lines, realised that a larger one-off ship, in many cases, was going to be needed, and that they could probably get funding to do this from the Dutch government, because the Dutch government would like to support workers who are currently unemployed due to the economic circumstances, and building a large ship was a great way to guarantee employment for a number of years for lots of people. And it does make you think, as I'm recording this in July 2020, we have just gone through a giant global downturn. And I don't know, something about working on building a giant ocean liner is quite interesting. Although I'm sure if given the opportunity, it would be absolutely awful by today's standards. But I digress. In this time period, the world received lots of the great legendary ocean liners that are still referred to today, such as the Queen Mary, the New Amsterdam, and the Normandie. And lots of these liners came to fruition due to government funding to help push economies out of recession. And also, lines were pushing the boundaries of how large their ships can be, and in some cases how grand they could be. I think some people argue that the Normandie hasn't been surpassed in how grand she was yet in terms of her interiors, but we're not going to get into that. Nonetheless, Rotterdam Lloyd jumped on this, and they decided that they needed a one-off large ocean liner for the route between the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies. So the board of Rotterdam Lloyd did what they had done many times before, and they approached a shipyard in the south of the Netherlands called De Schelde in Visselingen. Sorry, although I live in the Netherlands and my Dutch is okay, my pronunciation of some of the place names are atrocious. I apologise. Het spijt me, Nederlanders. But yeah, Rotterdam Lloyd and De Schelde, the shipyard, had a very tight relationship, very comparable to what the White Star Line and Holland and Wharf had, where most of the line's ships were built at this yard. And the extent of this relationship was quite deep. Each time Rotterdam Lloyd wanted to build a ship that was larger than the yard could handle, without even thinking about it, the yard would always implement these changes, even to the extent of changing the city's seawall in the 1930s to allow the Dempo to be built. So in 1938, when the order came through for a large 192-metre long ocean liner, the yard yet again had to go through substantial changes to be able to accommodate such a large ship being built there. This meant workshops had to be upgraded, cranes had to be built, slipways had to be extended, and even a local bridge had to be widened to allow for this ship to leave. However, it wasn't long after all these alterations were done, and only 25 days into 1939, the keel was laid of what was then known as bow number 214. The ship was also going to take advantage of a new construction technique at the time, welding, But despite this, there would still be almost 1 million rivets inside this ship. Nonetheless, welding was used in a lot of the internal compartments and in quite a lot of the superstructure. And although she's not the first ocean liner to ever receive welding in her construction, we will see as we go on, the Willem Ruys had lots of firsts and lots of groundbreaking techniques used in her construction and her design. That being said, however, there were still some pompous leftovers from the past, such as having a semi-false funnel, for the grand reason of her main competitor, the MS Oranje, from a shipping company in Amsterdam, only had one funnel. So this relates back to the Olympic class having an extra funnel, an extra false funnel for no apparent reason other than aesthetics. Although, as the case with the Willem Ruys and with the Olympic class, this funnel did serve some sort of functionality in terms of ventilation. So not all stupid, but yeah. The Willem Ruys would also receive a bulbous bow, very similar to what we see on Normandy. It protruded from underneath the water slightly, but yeah, nothing like we would expect to see on a modern ship. Now, if you've paid attention to the dates that I've been saying, you would know that 1939 and the Netherlands, you're getting close to something pretty bad. And that's because in May of 1940, the Nazis did invade the Netherlands. In World War I, the Dutch had declared neutrality and it worked out pretty well for them. However, Hitler had other ideas this time around. By this time, the Willem Ruys herself, she was still sitting on the slipway. Her hull was about 75% complete, not anywhere near being launched, not anywhere near being completed, but still a fair amount along the way. The to-be home city of the Willem Ruys, Rotterdam, was quite heavily damaged throughout the invasion. The entire centre of the city was basically completely destroyed, and a lot of the port was also damaged. And although lots of ships were lost during this bombardment, during the invasion, the Willem Ruys was lucky that, I think, because of where she wasn't in the water, and she wasn't in a high target for the Nazis, that she survived this initial invasion. However, when it came to her construction, everything lost any sense of meaning, really. Everything changed. There was no business case. She could not be completed for commercial services. The Nazis would not allow that. And even if they did, it was very likely that the Allies would sink her as soon as she left the Dutch-occupied port. And also, not long after the Netherlands was invaded, the Dutch East Indies were also invaded by the Japanese. So there would be nowhere for this ship to go. And yeah, no ocean liner had a normal life throughout this war. So it stands to reason that an uncompleted ocean liner also wouldn't. However, before the invasion of the Netherlands, the Dutch did realise that Japan was potentially going to be a threat to their colonial possession, and the Willem Ruys had a side plan where there would be gun turrets and cannons installed on her deck, and there's even blueprints available of what the ship actually looked like in reality, but with these defensive weapons on her. And at the time, the Dutch were also building up their East India fleet of warships to deter the Japanese. It's sad that they didn't pay that much attention to their neighbours, but we won't get into that, and it's not as simple as I just made out. But yeah, nonetheless, the Germans knew these plans existed, and initially they tried to complete the Willem Ruys according to these plans with the weapons on the deck. This, however, for the local Dutch resistance, was an issue. They did not want the ship to be used in the Nazi war effort, and they also didn't want the ship to be used as it would become a target for the Allies. They didn't want this Dutch possession to be sent to the bottom just because the Germans wanted to use it for a few war points, basically. And this led to some really amazing stories where workers and the Dutch resistance in general in this part of the country where the Willem Ruys was being built would steal or just make disappear building materials for the ship that made it unfeasible for the Germans to complete her. My favourite story is of part of the Willem Ruys' engine, which just disappeared into the countryside in a farm for the duration of the war, just to hide these parts from the Nazis. And it's a true testament to the Dutch resistance on how they were able to do this. However, they might have been a little bit too successful, because then the Nazis realised that the ship was only going to be useful as scrap metal. And again, this posed a problem for the Dutch resistance. They didn't want this ship to be destroyed in any way. They certainly didn't want the building materials that were already in the hull to be used to feed the Nazi war effort. So again, the Dutch resistance sabotaged any effort to scrap the ship. Cranes were made unoperational, and any equipment that would be needed to dismantle such a large object was either disappeared again or made to break, effectively. And so, effectively, the Nazis just left the ship. They just left it alone, and I think had plans for later on that got interrupted by the liberation. Additionally, the ship served as a symbol for Zeeland, the province where she was being built in the Netherlands, that the Netherlands one day again will be free and will be able to do things like build great, amazing ships and not be under the thumb of Nazi Germany. So there was that. There was another reason why the ship they could not afford for the ship to go. It would be yet another crushing blow to morale. However, there was also another problem that faced the uncompleted hull of the Willem Ruys. The Allies were pretty clear to the Dutch government in exile in London that where the ship was being built was too much of a valuable asset for the Nazis and that it needed to be damaged by Allied bombings. So, in response, the Dutch government in exile produced aerial images of where the ship was on the slipway, what yard she was at, and all of this to try and persuade the Allies to avoid hitting the hull with their bombs. And the city where she was built was quite heavily damaged by Allied bombing. Even the yard that she was sitting in was almost completely destroyed by Allied bombing. But the Willem Ruys herself was relatively unharmed. She was damaged slightly, but nowhere near as much as the buildings around her. And I don't know, I've read in the books that it's because of this meeting between the exiled Dutch government and the British, but bombing in the 1940s was not a precise act. So I think it's more down to luck. And it's a possibility that the British just said, yeah, we'll try and not hit it, don't worry. And, they just got lucky. But I could be wrong. I don't know. I'm not a 1940s bomb expert or aiming expert. But hey-ho, we should be lucky that she wasn't hit, I guess. And lucky too for the Dutch themselves, as shipping in the Netherlands throughout the war was completely decimated. Many of their ports, including the port of Rotterdam, were heavily damaged or even destroyed throughout the war. And Rotterdam Lloyd themselves, they lost almost all of their ocean liners, and even though some of their ocean liners did survive, they didn't have access to them right away, and lots of them were heavily damaged themselves. They did sadly lose the Belloren and the Dempo. The Dempo was sunk in the Mediterranean whilst being a troop ship for the Allies, and on the other side, the Belloren struck a mine whilst operating for the Germans, as she was in Rotterdam at the time of the invasion. So this mandated that there be an awful lot of pressure to complete the Willem Ruys as soon as the Netherlands was liberated, as Dutch shipping needed to recover, and Rotterdam Lloyd themselves also needed to recover. However, it was not plain sailing even after the liberation, as so much of Europe had been damaged or destroyed throughout the war. Building materials for buildings and ships and things that were needed to build ships were incredibly hard to come by. And so it took an awful lot of time and effort to get the Willem Ruys to a point where she could be launched. However, a little bit after 2 years after the liberation, in 1946, all 600,000 kilograms of what was then known as bow number 214 was ready to be launched into the sea and be fitted out. And to begin the ceremony, a woman would wave her hand, and this acted as a metaphorical launching. However, her waving her hand would signify to all the yard workers to remove the blocks and release the ship effectively. There's some sort of hydraulic mechanism involved. My Dutch isn't great enough to fully understand what was written. However, something like that happened. And of course, the stern gently slips into the sea. It went fine. There were no great problems as far as I can read. But most importantly, it was also this time where bow number 214, as she was known, got her name. And prior to this, the Rotterdam Lloyd would name their ships after hurricanes? No, would name their ships after volcanoes in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. However, before the invasion, no name had been agreed for what we now know as Willem Ruys should be called. And the trauma of the Second World War and of the occupation, especially on Rotterdam Lloyd and the Rotterdam area, and even the shipyard area, was so great that it was decided that this naming mechanism would be skipped for this ship. And the board of Rotterdam Lloyd was very clever in how they decided to name the ship, because when they chose Willem Ruys, they effectively killed two birds with one stone. As not only was Willem Ruys back in the 1800s a key figure in the development of Rotterdam Lloyd and the first signals of what we actually got to see as Rotterdam Lloyd in later decades, but a descendant of that Willem Ruys also was in charge of, he was the general manager of Rotterdam Lloyd at the time of the invasion, and he sadly was murdered by the Nazis for a rather trivial reason. Back in Rotterdam, the Willem Ruys, the man in the 1940s, refused to allow German officers to join the Rotterdam Rowing and Sailing Club called the Maas, named after the river that runs through Rotterdam. Understandably so, if you ask me. If an invading force destroyed half of my city and had taken all my ships away, of which many of them would end up at the bottom of the sea, I wouldn't allow people from that organisation which had done that to row in my rowing club. But hélas, he was murdered, unfortunately. And the board of Rotterdam Lloyd decided it would be a good name to remember him and his ancestor who created the line itself. And so bow number 214 became the MS Willem Ruys. The next process, of course, was fitting out. And this is when the unique profile of the Willem Ruys kind of came into its own. She was a very interesting mix between kind of like a 1950s space age, but also a kind of, but not quite, Art Deco feeling. So when you look at her, she's a very unusual ship. She kind of looks a little bit like a pyramid, even, if you think about it, because she does kind of go up into the middle with her funnels acting kind of like a paramount. And her superstructure is incredibly tall, especially for a liner of that era. She's kind of reminiscent of like a short and stubby Normandy or Queen Mary. Despite this, however, the Willem Ruys still maintained a tradition with Dutch colonial liners, the liners that went from the Netherlands to modern-day Indonesia, where the superstructures and the outside deck of the ship is very unique. And from a distance, no matter what Dutch colonial line, whether it was Rotterdam Lloyd or whether it was the Dutch line, the Nederland line, or Stoomvaartmaatschappij Nederland, they all had a very similar appearance, these ships. They had large sun decks, they had lots of awning spaces, and the superstructures were very busy looking, especially in the 1930s. And the Willem Ruys was an interpretation of this which was toned down, but nonetheless, she still fitted in this group. And it's a very uniquely Dutch design of ship. I'm not saying that other ships didn't look like this, but most of the ships that had these busy superstructures with large awning spaces, if you saw them, you would think, oh, she's probably a Dutch liner. That is how iconic this design was to the Dutch colonial marine architecture. And of course, it's fitting that the Willem Ruys, who really was the last Dutch colonial liner, would maintain this outward appearance. Also, I'm catching myself saying Dutch colonial liner a lot, and I can feel my Irish ancestors turn in their graves as I say colonialism in a positive way. So I just want to say, although I'm talking about these ships in a positive way, and they were Dutch colonial liners, I cannot support, and I am not glorifying the larger history surrounding these ships and what they were a part of. Just after the Second World War, after the Netherlands was liberated, and after modern-day Indonesia was liberated from Japan, the Netherlands did fight a very shameful war trying to maintain Indonesia as a colony, and I do love the Netherlands. It's been my home for the last 3 years, and I am in love with this country. I have no plans to leave it, but that part of history is incredibly shameful. And yeah, I just want people to know that whilst I am glorifying the ships that were a part of this governmental mechanism, outside of the design of these ships and outside what these ships were, I'm not glorifying that. And yeah, I just wanted to make sure that was very clear. And I don't think that's controversial. And I think anyone that thinks that's controversial, well, I don't want you listening to my stuff, really. Colonialism's bad. But yeah, okay. But getting back to things, right, where were we? Sun decks. Right, so if you look at a before and after picture of the SS France, when she was the SS France, and then the SS France when she was the SS Norway, you will notice that at her stern, she went from having a fairly streamlined stern to having like an overhanging deck. Obviously, her conversion from an ocean liner to a cruise ship, the Norwegian who bought her wanted to increase her deck space, and that was one of the things they did. They basically built the deck over the side, more so than was already there, and that is very similar to what the Willem Ruys was designed like. And the SS France is a great way of actually explaining what I mean, because I'm not very good at explaining it myself. But yeah, so the designers really tried to maximize the amount of deck space that was available, and I think they could kind of see the writing on the wall that ocean liner travel, although she was designed in the heyday, kind of in the 1930s, late 1930s, they, I think, understood that they were going to have to adapt. And someone is opening my front door. One moment. Okay, right. Yeah, no, that was just my partner coming home. Right, where were we? The Willem Ruys, in terms of her propulsion. Now, this is an area I definitely am not an expert in. I know nothing when it comes to the inner workings of a ship in terms of their propulsion. So please forgive me if I say anything that sounds really stupid. This is only what I've read and what I have been able to kind of understand. So in terms of propulsion, she had 2 engine rooms, which I guess makes sense if she had 2 propeller shafts, but I don't know. She had an 8x8 cylinder to power these 2 propellers, and she was designed to reach a speed of 22 knots with 4,000 horsepower. This meant that in reality she had 215 revolutions a minute on each propeller. So that is actually 22 knots apparently in normal conditions. What I'm going to say about that, because I can't say much more without plagiarizing someone's book word for word. So we'll move on to her roll tanks, or anti-roll tanks, I should say, which were quite revolutionary at the time, I believe. Although I think roll tanks had been installed on some warships at this time, and also I think some minor tanks have been explored upon on some ocean liners. She was the first ocean liner with a truly functioning anti-roll tank that actually had a great deal of effect, apparently. So I've read. I don't know if that's true. That might just be a Dutch person who's trying to pump her up a bit. But yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. So the design of the tank, I assume this is pretty standard, was that there would be tanks that went up the side of the hull quite a considerable way at some point in the ship, I imagine, at midships or around there. There was this quite intricate system of pipes going between the port and the starboard side, going into like the belly of the ship, to try and connect these 2 tanks so water could freely flow between the 2. I believe also that water could flow on like kind of between like in the double bottom, but I'm not too sure if that's what this image is showing. I don't know how to read technical drawings very well. I can with buildings, but not with ships, not with things with moving parts. So I'm not quite sure what this means, but it does look quite quite intricate, and apparently this was a first for an ocean liner. And apparently it also worked quite well. She had quite a long life, the Willem Ruys. Not always called the Willem Ruys, but this system apparently stayed in there and is still there today because she lies on the bottom, but we'll get to that later. But while speaking of interior, let's actually go into her actual interior. Now, again, I am no great design know-it-all. I don't know much about interior design. I don't know much about physical design really either. But when it comes to interior design, that is a massive weak spot of mine. I have no idea what I'm talking about. So I don't know what is relevant and what is not relevant for most people. So just things that jumped out to me, I will cover. Now, apparently, the Willem Ruys lacks straight lines. She was a very curvy ship in many ways, and this is due to her kind of being a streamlined vessel and the period that she was designed for. Now, in like the 1950s and early 60s, it was kind of like a space agey type theme going on in lots of infrastructure projects and buildings and ocean liners. Even cars and trains at that time had a very specific look to them. I think if you think of like an American diner from the 1950s and 60s theme that the Willem Ruys was ever so slightly etching into. So she wasn't quite there, but she was on the cusp of it because, of course, she was designed in the 1930s and built throughout the 1940s. And this meant she had quite a significant ship look and feel to her, even on the inside. And this even got someone to remark that she was the last ship with a ship-like character. And what they mean by this is that there was no attention given to making any passenger on board believe that they were anywhere but on a ship. However, at the same time, this doesn't mean that, they had, giant portholes with rivets everywhere and all of that. But instead that the marine character of the ship was complemented by her interiors to make you were on a ship, but this was a good thing, this was a positive thing, and not to make you think that you were in a hotel or that you were anywhere on land. So she was an experience in her own right, in her interiors. Additionally, the class system at the time was going through turmoil. Pre-war in the Netherlands, there wasn't too much of a class system like you would expect in the United Kingdom, even in France. However, class still did play a role, especially when you're talking about the Dutch colonies. And the Willem Ruys kind of had to go through a design change after the war because the class system had disintegrated further, much like it had in the rest of Europe pretty much, especially in the UK. And this meant that the difference between the classes was not too great, and that she had to be more dynamic than she was originally designed for. Although this didn't apparently prove to be too much of a problem, but it was notable. And also she had to be designed to be less pompous inside, but more sophisticated. The sort of traveller that was going to be on her was not a Dutch aristocrat of sorts. It was not going to be a colonial master anymore. It was more likely to be a tourist. It was more likely to be teachers and young professionals and mid-level professionals, people who wouldn't ordinarily travel on an ocean liner, would less likely in the past have been able to travel in a higher class on an ocean liner. So her design had to reflect that. And of course, being a more sophisticated liner with a more sophisticated interior, but kind of avoiding the pompous which is associated a lot with Cunard at the time, and especially with the pre-war with the Normandy, she was going to avoid that. This apparently was done quite well with 3 pools, which I think 1 or 2 of them were multi-class in terms of you would have first class and tourist class sharing a pool. 2 of the pools were actually on deck. One of them, now I'm not sure if this was where the Willem Ruys was again setting firsts, but something that I thought was a recent application to marine design was that she had a pool in her forecastle. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but yeah, she had a pool just aft of her forward mast, and so from the bridge, effectively, you could, in theory, I think, look down and look into the pool. And I've seen this on a few cruise ships today. I believe one of the Disney cruise ships has this. I don't know anything about modern cruise ships really, but yeah, she had that, and I think again that is testament to her design purpose. She was going to be in warmer climates most of the time, and yeah, when it's like 30 degrees and quite humid, I imagine being in a nice cool pool is a great way to regulate your body temperature, especially when you're on a metal object floating in the middle of the sea. But yeah, also escalators were used quite heavily in her design. I say heavily, there was only 4 of them, but apparently this was quite a revolutionary feature as well. Also, they were in crew and passenger areas, so that's nice. It's nice that Rotterdam Lloyd was looking after their crew. Rosewood and like cherry-coloured wood with copper was used quite heavily throughout the ship in passenger areas, and this apparently created quite a warm feeling, but also quite a light and airy feeling at the same time. So again, if you think to the Queen Mary, she's quite a dark ship, very mid-Art Deco feeling, where there's lots of exposed wood and there's lots of dark metals or like bronze type metals. With not fantastic lighting by modern standards. The Willem Ruys apparently, and the same with lots of Dutch ships, had some of these darker aspects, but also had them in a lighter context. I'm not sure how this looks in reality. I've seen colorized pictures of what the Willem Ruys looked like, but unfortunately I can't share them. I don't have the rights to them. But nonetheless, they do. It's very difficult to explain, but it seems like she had quite a pink theme throughout, or like a red theme. So the darkness kind of wasn't there in the same way. She felt warm, but also quite bright, and I think that's quite important if you are transitioning from quite a dark, wet country like the Netherlands is for most of the year to such a bright and vibrant place such as Southeast Asia. And of course, along the way, you're going through quite a myriad of climates and temperatures. So yeah, that's nice. Also, she had 1,400 steps. That doesn't seem like a terrific amount to me, but hey-ho. And also she had 1.5 kilometres of hallway. So I believe that's just over a mile. I'm not sure. I've not had to deal with miles for a long time. But yeah. And when she would have been completed and ready for her first voyage, she would have had 100,000 linen items. So I imagine that goes from everything from towels to bedding sheets and all that sort of stuff. Another notable item, of course, would have been the Willem Ruys' books. She did have 3,000 of them in her library. This seemed like quite a small number to me. However, I've since read that the Rotterdam Lloyd did encourage passengers to bring their own books and to bring a number of these books with them so that they could swap and trade books with other passengers. This increased the average passenger's repertoire of literature, and of course it created more of an environment on the ship and more of a conversation starter, I believe, between these passengers who otherwise might not have struck up conversations. Also, when it comes to entertainment aboard the Willem Ruys and other Rotterdam Lloyd vessels, there were many English-speaking people on board these ships because Rotterdam Lloyd stopped off in Southampton a lot of the time and would also stop off in France and Gibraltar and other ports along the way. So they amassed a large non-speaking group of passengers often. However, if you spoke only Dutch, or if you spoke Dutch, you would be okay. Apparently there was more entertainment for you in terms of shows, in terms of literature. And if you spoke English, there'd be less, but there would still be an acceptable number. But if you did not speak English and you did not speak Dutch, you were in trouble, basically. You had yourself to rely on. And I imagine if you only spoke an obscure language such as, in a Dutch context, such as Arabic or potentially Italian or Swedish, for example, you probably would you'd have your own books to rely upon. It's unlikely that there would be many other passengers who shared that language with you, and the library probably wouldn't be too much help for you either. And it does say in lots of the books that I've read about Rotterdam Lloyd that there was this problem, there was this divide between the Dutch passengers and non-Dutch passengers in terms of language ability and what you could achieve in terms of entertainment aboard these vessels. This is a great contrast to Holland America Line, where English-speaking passengers, were greatly accommodated for, whereas in Rotterdam Lloyd, they're kind of like an afterthought, and then people who didn't speak English or Dutch were kind of like a not thought of at all, kind of. However, that's just the times back then, and when everything is in print or everything has to be live, then it is more forgivable, I guess, to focus only on your two main language groups. But yes, enough rambling about that. Moving on to her sea trials, they did last for a few days. I thought this was quite unusual, so they lasted from the 15th to the 18th of November 1947, and there's not too much written about them, which I guess is a good thing. However, there were problems in terms of the speed that she could get to. She could get to 24 knots, which is 2 knots faster than her build speed, but apparently there were problems about maintaining this. However, she could successfully maintain 22 knots quite well. There were other issues, a lot to do with the type of materials that were used in the latter parts of her construction. Nothing that affected her ability to sail or her safety, apparently, but it was remarked that the quality and the shortage of materials that existed in Europe at the time, due to the massive rebuilding projects that were going on, and of course the shortages that resulted from that the quality of some of her fixtures was less than desirable. However, as time went on, this was slowly repaired. And because of how long it took to do a voyage on her, especially if you were travelling directly, not that anyone would have done this, but anyone was going from the Netherlands on her all the way to Indonesia and then sailing directly back on her immediately, you would have been gone, I think, for about 6 weeks. So it wouldn't have taken many voyages or many passenger loads for a lot of these problems to be fixed. So her reputation was not too badly affected by the lack of quality. And also, any liner at the time would have had this problem because every liner had to be either built or refurbished quite significantly. And if you even look at the Holland America Line's New Amsterdam, despite the fact she had interiors that existed before the Second World War, most of them had to be redone anyways because of the condition that they were kept in throughout the war. And they were kept in New York. They should have been fine, but they weren't. And so this was a problem common. This was a common problem for liners at the time. Nonetheless, however, when the Willem Ruys went out on her sea trials, this was a massive event for the province of Zeeland, where she was built, and the city of Vlissingen, which I'm saying wrong. In English, it's Flushing, which is easy to remember. As the ship had been a landmark for the city for almost 8 years. So seeing her finally sail away and get ready to be handed over to Rotterdam Lloyd was a really big event for these people. And she had been such a part of the war effort and the resistance against the Nazis that it was such a spectacle to see her go. And I think for many people it was probably quite emotional in a negative way. However, I think for many people it was probably great because it was probably nice to actually to see a ship go off and that be a mark of standard of what should have been happening throughout the war but couldn't. And yeah, it was a return to normal for many people. So before I start talking about the service life of the Willem Ruys, I just want to quickly talk about a book that I found today whilst recording this. About the Rotterdam Lloyd, which is written in English, and it's called The History of a House Flag. And I'm not too sure if it was published in the Netherlands or not. I'm assuming it probably wasn't. But from my experience, Dutch books after World War II, right after World War II, so in the remaining years of the 40s, after 1945, do not have the year that the book was published or much information about the publishers. And this book is no different, or in fact, it's misleading because the first year that comes up is 1939. However, in the appendix, you do have pictures of the Willem Ruys, and you have a quick talk about what the ship is and whatever. But prior to the appendix, following like the historiography of the book, talks about all the other ships and events that happened in the line's history. Apart from the Second World War, that's not mentioned. It does say in the very last page before the appendix, 214, and I'm assuming that's referencing bow number 214, which is what the Willem Ruys was known as. And there is also a well-drawn an artist's impression of what the 214 was going to look like. As yet unnamed ship. And it is clearly the Willem Ruys. And there is a page talking about this great ship that's going to be built in Flushing, the city where the Willem Ruys was built, and that she was going to, in 1941, she will go to sea to do her best, blasé as you may be, with ocean travel in overindulged circumstances. Even so, she will rebuke and humble you with her grace and dignity. And blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And I find it just very strange that this is all written here. And this book basically goes all the way through without acknowledging that the Second World War happens, and then the appendix does, and the Willem Ruys is basically goes from being a concept to actually existing, and then them having actually a number of pictures, even a picture of her launch. So I don't know if this book was first published as like there was an original version, and then there was like a second edition after the war where they just decided not to update and talk about what happened in the war. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting, and especially that I found it in English is quite special as well. And no doubt I will use this book for lots of my future projects, whether that be on Instagram or a podcast version. But yeah, old books are cool. So, oops, it's fine. So yes, now I am going to go through the service history of the Willem Ruys. And as I've already said many times before, the Willem Ruys was designed to go on the route between Rotterdam and the Dutch East Indies, with a load of stops along the way. Now, this route as a passenger route was really came into its own during the 1910s, as I said before, during the conversion to the mailboat concept. And the Willem Ruys, of course, when she was designed, was going to continue this. However, the Dutch government, in a move which is common with what they still do today, decided that they were going to change how they were going to award mail contracts. Now, before the Second World War, the Dutch government had already decided that some shorter distance mail, so inter-European mail originating in the Netherlands or going to the Netherlands, was going to be done by air. And this was relatively, this was quite a brave step for the Dutch government, but they did it anyways. And of course, during the Second World War, aviation was further improved, and the beginning of the 1950s was kind of when the aviation age started to get one-ups on the ocean liner age. So by 1947, the Dutch government made quite a landmark decision, really, to award KLM, the Dutch airline, the mail contract for long routes, including the routes to Indonesia from the Netherlands. And this basically removed a lot of Dutch liner companies, their major source of income. So the mailboat concept kind of went out the window. However, of course, the passenger market for airliners at that time was quite small, and so companies like Rotterdam Lloyd could still take advantage of the relatively lucrative passenger market. Just a very large part of their revenue had just been siphoned off. And of course, this didn't go down too well. It was thought of throughout the Dutch maritime community that the Dutch seamen and the Dutch sea companies throughout the wartime period had sacrificed so much for the country, and the government afterwards kind of just threw them under the bus, or plane in this instance. And yeah, I can kind of agree with that. However, I guess moving forward, and you have to make difficult decisions. And also, the Dutch government today is still obsessed with aviation. They prioritise it a lot more than I think many other countries do. Maybe it's to do with the King of the Netherlands. He flies for KLM, so maybe that's why. Like, literally, he is a pilot for KLM. Look it up. It's crazy. But yeah, so Rotterdam Lloyd, they took what they had and they just went with the passenger market. And of course, they still had a cargo element to their liners, their passenger liners, with larger cargoes that aircraft couldn't carry. And also, it's important to remember that Rotterdam Lloyd, they were always a cargo company first before they were a passenger company. They always had purely cargo ships. And yeah, so the main bulk of their business was unaffected. It was just this lucrative mail contract that they had lost, which made up a large subsidy for their passenger side. Nevertheless, they made the passenger side work, and yeah, so the Willem Ruys was ready to do her Rotterdam, Southampton, Marseille, Port Said, Aden, Colombo or Singapore route, and then of course into Indonesia. And her maiden voyage took place on the 2nd of December 1947. She was completely booked for it. And the passengers on board got ready to leave the, at that time, quite cold Western Europe for the summer months. And really, there's not too much written about her maiden voyage. Her and her 871 passengers, they all got to Indonesia on time. There was no great delays. There was no great problems. The crew was very inexperienced, this because she was a brand new ship. She was the largest ship that Rotterdam Lloyd had. And also, a lot of the crew had been stuck on land throughout the war period and hadn't had enough time to get too much experience after the war at being at sea. So this was their first appointment, a lot of them, back at sea, or their first appointment on an ocean liner back at sea. So there were some teething problems there. And of course, with every new liner, there's always going to be problems which need to be solved. But in the Willem Ruys' case, there is not much written. So I'm assuming no news is good news. But of course, there are testimonials from celebrations that happened along the way. And obviously, when the Willem Ruys got to Indonesia, got to her final destination, there was a big celebration on board. There was a bit of a bitchy remark from some of the captains of Dutch ships that were in that port in Indonesia at the time, saying that they weren't invited on board for these celebrations, and I think they were a bit bitter about that. But hey ho, it can't please everybody, I guess. And in the years following her maiden voyage, she had a trend of being fully booked, and there are no great events really to speak of. Politically, however, the situation was changing quite rapidly. The Netherlands and what is now Indonesia had fought a war which concluded in Indonesia becoming an independent republic, separate from the Netherlands. And this at first didn't really seem to affect the passage of Dutch colonial liners going to Indonesia. However, undoubtedly, it did cast doubt on the future of the service. As we go into the 1950s, the European settlers in Indonesia did slowly start to come back to Europe. And this was a very unsustainable business model for Rotterdam Lloyd, because obviously their captive market was slowly using them to get back to the Netherlands, not to go back to Indonesia. So there were lots of one-way tickets, which is never good for a liner company, especially if they're going back to the country where they originate from. So yeah, that proved to be a bit of a dip. However, the line Rotterdam Lloyd and the Willem Ruys managed to maintain their presence on the line until 1958, with only one really notable event happening, and this was the collision with the MS Oranje, another Dutch colonial liner, who I think I mentioned earlier. And at this point, the Oranje and the Willem Ruys were kind of like frenemies. They were kind of fleet mates or running mates in the sense that Rotterdam Lloyd would run one service, and the company that owned the Oranje, the Nederlands Stoombootmaatschappij, the Dutch steamship company, would run the other service. So you'd basically have them. They would never be competing for travellers on the same, like in the same week, if that makes sense. So the Willem Ruys would leave Rotterdam, and then a few weeks later, whilst the Willem Ruys was on her way back to Rotterdam, the Oranje would leave Amsterdam, and they would pass somewhere along the way. So they would offer a semi-continuous service, and they wouldn't compete directly with one another. This relationship turned out to be quite successful, and it also meant that when the two liners would meet one another along the route, they would have a bit of a celebration. Now, this often happened around about halfway through, so not long before or after the Suez Canal, if everything was going to plan. And in 1955, one such meeting had quite a dramatic ending. So normally they would use this meeting of the two liners crossing each other's paths as an event for the passengers, where they'd come out on deck and they would blow the ship's horns or whatever, and maybe have some other sort of thing. I don't know if they used fireworks. I imagine they probably would, although fireworks at sea is a bit of a risky business because it might be seen as a flare. But yeah. And for whatever reason, the Willem Ruys and Oranje collided. I don't know who was at fault. I don't think it was ever properly decided, and I don't know if it was even investigated properly, because obviously it happened in international waters, and the two ships were operated by two companies in a quite a strong relationship. So although there would have been an investigation, I haven't been able to come across who was determined to be the actor at fault. But it wasn't too serious. Both of the ships were still watertight afterwards, and they could continue their journeys. Now, the damage to the Willem Ruys wasn't too bad, actually. I think if you stood back to see the entire ship in your eyesight, you probably wouldn't have even been able to see what had happened. However, the Oranje, she got messed up pretty badly. Her bow completely collapsed in. So not quite as bad as the Stockholm after she'd hit the Andrea Doria, but it's similar. And if you're on YouTube now, I should have a picture of what the Oranje's bow looked like, or, well, lack thereof of bow, to be honest. There wasn't much left. But still, she managed to continue her way, and once the Willem Ruys got to Rotterdam, she was repaired quite quickly, and things went back to normal within a few weeks. And by 1956, the Willem Ruys had sailed the equivalent distance of going from the Earth to the Moon 5 times. So, yeah, that's quite impressive. However, the politics of Indonesia becoming independent was beginning to catch up with the service from the Netherlands to Indonesia, and by 1959, it was decided to end the passenger service. And this meant that both the Willem Ruys and Oranje would leave this ocean liner service effectively, ending Rotterdam Lloyd's not monopoly, but their dominance of the route that had begun in 1875. So Rotterdam Lloyd decided that she wasn't worth scrapping. She was still a very valuable liner, and cruising had begun to get popular, or even more popular, and so they have decided that it was worth converting her into a full-time cruise ship. And this led to a fairly major refit, where her funnels were given 3 meters more in height. She was fully air-conditioned, so before she was only partially air-conditioned, now she was completely. She got an extra pool, a new theatre, her engines got a bit of a revamp, she got more elevators, and her passenger cabins got a really large overhaul. The exterior of the ship, you can see where extra decks were added and where the superstructure was extended. And it wasn't too long before she had re-entered passenger service, although this time as a fully functional cruise ship instead of an ocean liner. Yet again, the Dutch Steamship Company and Rotterdam Lloyd did team up to offer world cruises, whereby the Oranje, who had also gone through a conversion, would sail west, and the Willem Ruys would sail east. And this would result in an average of a 63-day cruise for both, This turned out to be quite a profitable venture for the two companies. However, it didn't last forever. And I also apologise if you can hear vibrations. My neighbour is drilling. I've waited a long time to try and wait for them to stop, and it's not stopping. So hopefully it won't be too distracting, but hey-ho, I'll see what I can do. Right, so now I think it's stopped. And if you do hear random rumblings in the background, I'm just going to have to power through it. I apologise. So, getting back to the Willem Ruys. By the mid-1960s, Rotterdam Lloyd was finding it difficult to operate cruises. Now, Rotterdam Lloyd had kind of reverted back to being a fully cargo line at this point. Although they did have the Willem Ruys, it wasn't when the mail boat concept kind of fell through for them in 1947, they decided not to pursue the passenger route as much anymore. And when it came to cruising, obviously the cargo side of cruising is non-existent. You can't really use a cruise ship as a cargo ship, as there's not it's just not an efficient use of the ship. So the business case for Rotterdam Lloyd to keep operating the Willem Ruys was just diminishing more and more and more. So they decided to lease out the ship to companies like P&O, a British company for cruising, and they just steadily wound down their passenger side. And this is just because they were focusing more on cargo. It worked for them before, it was working for them now. Throughout the Second World War, they had lost an awful lot of their passenger liners, and they were never replaced. And when Indonesia got independence, this was it for Rotterdam Lloyd's passenger ambitions. And this is unlike Holland America Line, who had always focused on passengers and had cargo as a secondary venture. And this was why Holland America Line was able to go into cruising quite successfully. They had many liners, and they'd always had the focus on passenger liners. They never had too much of a disparity, where they had to share their fleet between passenger liners and cargo liners. Even Holland America Line cargo liners had passenger spaces, or a significant amount of passenger spaces. So for them, it was a lot easier. For other Dutch lines, it was a lot harder, as they had more of a focus on cargo, and Rotterdam Lloyd was no different. And so when the Willem Ruys was their only passenger vessel, it became inefficient to operate a cruise ship, and the difficult decision was made to let the Willem Ruys go. And this was in November 1964, where she was sold to the Italian company Lauro Lines, I think it said, and she was renamed the Achille Lauro. And that's the end of the Willem Ruys as the Willem Ruys. This is the first time she had left Dutch ownership. And she was sold for 15 million euros, or what is today 15 million euros, because the euro has only existed really since 2002. Funnily enough, the Oranje, the frenemy ship of the Willem Ruys, also went to Lauro Lines, and they both had long careers. Well, the Willem Ruys had a longer career with Lauro Lines, and in its own right, the Achille Lauro, the ex-Willem Ruys, it's a completely different story from this point on, and I do not feel like I should go into great detail on what happened with the Willem Ruys once she became an Italian liner. But basically, the rundown: she became an immigrant ship for the Italians, so she would go from Italy to mainly Australia. This was after a very heavy conversion, so her funnels were altered to be quite space agey. She was painted blue largely, with a white superstructure. Her interiors were very heavily changed, and she had a new bow put on, and she wasn't unrecognizable, but she was a very different ship afterwards. And the same with the Oranje, but although with the Oranje, you probably wouldn't think they were the same ship, to be honest. But and I might put a comparison of what she looked like if you're watching on YouTube. Same with the Oranje, just because why not? And so after many years serving with the Dutch, she had travelled with almost 200,000 passengers. She had travelled 3.5 million kilometres. And she became an iconic ship for the Netherlands and for Rotterdam. And especially Rotterdam at that time was rebuilding after a really savage bombing during the war. So she was a very, very strong national icon for both regionally and for the entire nation of the Netherlands. So for her to be sold to foreign interests was quite a blow. And in lots of books I read, there's always a quote where it says, "Men don't cry," but this really tested that resolve. And yeah, I'm sure it did. When she was operating as the Achille Lauro, she made world headlines a number of times, actually. One time she got hijacked, I think near Egypt. It might have been Libya, that part of the world, though, which resulted in the death of an American passenger. And then there was a film that was like filmed on board about this hijacking, which was, filmed literally on board the Achille Lauro, which is quite cool. And unfortunately, in 1994, off the coast of Somalia, quite close to her route that she would have passed through when she was a Dutch colonial liner, she caught fire and had to be evacuated with the eventual sinking of her. Her wreck has never been sought for, has never been sought after, and although there are images of her sinking, there's no images of her final moments, as after the evacuation, the passengers were taken on board other ships which were quite far away, or they were taken on helicopters back to the mainland of Africa, and she slipped below the waves, either at night or when no one was around to document it. But this means that she's still there today. She's still on the bottom of the sea. Probably as she rests quite deep, it's likely that she isn't in one piece. And of course, a fire ripped through her before she sunk. So the wreck probably isn't that special to even search for. But she's there. It's probably better than going to a scrapyard. She had a lot longer life than many liners would have done. I think she was almost 50. And yeah, had she not sunk, she probably would have ended up in the scrapyard a few years after that anyways, as this was around the era where the cruise ships that we know today were beginning to come on to the cruise market. But yeah, that's the end of the Willem Ruys. I may cover the Achille Lauro in the future. It's not going to be my next episode. I don't know how this is going to go. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. And please let me know if you have any criticisms. At the time of recording, the test episode has only just been uploaded to Apple Podcasts, and the other podcasting hosts haven't accepted this podcast yet. But we'll see where that goes. So thank you very much for listening. I'm Alex. And yeah, if you want to email me, the.liner.pod@gmail.com is the email address, or just contact me, Dutch Liners, on Instagram. Yeah, thank you very much, and goodbye. Take care.